Hey, everybody, and welcome to a pop-up conversation about this book, Body Becoming, A Path to Our Liberation. And I have a special guest who's joining us. Hey, special guest, will you introduce yourself?
Hey there, it's Dr. Robyn Henderson-Espinoza. My affirming pronouns are they, them. I'm so thrilled to be here.
Hooray! I'm excited that you're here. I've been looking forward to this for a while. We've sort of made this a surprise pop-up because, hello, the body is becoming.
Yeah.
Um, but it's lovely to have you here. Would you be willing to name some of the intersections that you embody that you'd like to call into this space? Doesn't have to be all of them, but just the ones you want to name right now.
Yeah, well, I think since it's Autism Affirmation Month or Autism Awareness Month, I just want to say that I live on the spectrum and I am, eccentric and quirky and odd, and those are all gifts, divine gifts. I'm also born of a Mexican woman and an Anglo man, and so my ancestry is mixed, Mexican on one side and Scottish and Irish on the other side, and I take those intersections very seriously and often write from the place and space of Nepantla and Latinidad. I'm trans and queer and live in the borderlands of academia, the church, and the public square. Um, and I believe in the power of conversations and the power of relationships. And I think that ideas can change the world.
And we'll talk more about some of those identities, kind of particularly in ways that you uh, maybe spring from them and ponder about them in your writing. But first, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how some of these intersections inform your faith.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I keep saying that I keep leaving the church, and the church keeps inviting me back, and so that is a big piece of my faith. Um, went to Catholic school growing up, and never did make my first communion because I had theological questions. Was baptized at a Baptist church and felt really connected to the Baptist faith. But then in eighth grade, I was confirmed Lutheran, and so technically, if if we're being technical about things, I'm technically Lutheran. But I'm an equal opportunity player when it comes to church and denominations and whatnot. They all have something to bring to the table. Um, you know, I have I have a complicated relationship with Christianity, as a lot of people do. I think that's probably the most faithful response I can have is struggle. And I became a theologian. I was asking theological questions when I was very young. I was very interested in the big ideas of the world. Who is God? How do we know? Why are we here? What does it mean to make meaning in the world? And I think all of those questions and my study of philosophy and theology through graduate school and culminating in a PhD has helped me follow Jesus better. And I would say that I'm a follower of the ways of Jesus. I don't follow a man or an institution because we know that institutions are human made, man made, informed by empire. And I like to try to follow Jesus, and I try to be faithful in the small things. And sometimes that is easier said than done. But that's a little bit about my faith. It's more struggle than anything. But that's what makes it feel honest to me.
I like that. And I'll take a technical Lutheran over a non-Lutheran any day.
Yeah, so I'm in
So,
I'm in the roll book.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So you wrote a new book. You have several books, but like this is your
Yeah,
newest book, right?
that's the new book. It just dropped last Tuesday for Trans Day of Visibility.
Yes. And I love that as someone who's on the autistic spectrum and trans, I love that the Trans Day of Visibility and like Autism Awareness Time are connected,
Yeah.
right? Because
Yeah.
is the statistic something like trans folk are 6 times more likely to be autistic? Something like
Yes.
that?
That is the exact number.
I know I read about it in this
Yeah.
book.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I appreciated the ways that you sort of go into kind of the creativity that can come with having a diverse kind of brain and a diverse way of thinking. You wrote a little bit about how in some parts of your journey you thought your body was the things from the shoulders up,
Yeah.
right? With a name like Dr. Robyn and kind of an academic side, it's probably easy to think that all that we are is in kind of our knowing. Will you
Yeah.
speak a little bit about what you think a body is? Because I really appreciate some of the ways that you've spoke about what body is,
Yeah.
particularly when it's not necessarily only about flesh and bones.
Yeah. I think that, I grew up in the church and we didn't talk a lot about the body. We talked about the body of Christ as the church, but that didn't really get fleshed out too much. But I do connect with that sense of we all are a part of a body. And so certainly we have bodies. We are not just thinking machines. We are actually emotional beings who sometimes think. And I learned that today on Brene Brown's new series on HBO Max. And I really like that definition that bodies are emotional beings who sometimes think. And what oftentimes happens is we invert that. We become thinking machines that sometimes feel, but we don't really have the vocabulary or the language to talk about the landscape of affect or emotion because we're um, conscripted into the thinking part of our being. So I think bodies are complex. Bodies have wisdom. There are bodies within bodies. Every cell has a brain of sorts that helps our bodies do the thing that it has to do. And so, if we contain multitudes, then aren't we also within multitudes? And so, I think of my body is not disconnected from other bodies, but we are radically interconnected to other bodies. Like I tell my students, when you pull a string here, you find that it's connected to the other side of the world. And, it's almost like bodies are a butterfly effect. What happens here in Nashville does have an effect in California, where you are. Um, Sometimes that's energetic, sometimes that is physical, tangible, and other times it could be emotional or spiritual. But it's to say that our bodies are connected, and one of the most favorite rituals of mine, uh, where I get to think more deeply about bodies, is when we take communion because we are literally, physically, emotionally, spiritually um, imbibing on the fleshiness of Jesus. And I think that there's been lots of debates about that through the ecumenical councils in early church history. But when we really think about coming to the table together, it's an ancient practice. Every culture has it. Most religions have some kind of eating together or fasting together. We're in the season of Ramadan, and our Muslim siblings are fasting, and then there will be an iftar, probably family iftars. Given COVID, there won't be a community iftar, but we all sort of negotiate our bodies in different ways, and I think about these practices of eating together, this ancient ritual of coming to the table, that we can learn to be more human with one another. And so bodies are diverse. We all have bodies. Having a body is very humbling. I slipped in the shower and hit my head on the tub wall yesterday, and so it's very humbling for me to have a body that can slip and fall and be hurt. And yet, um, the body, the collective body, is a beautiful tapestry of difference. And when we embrace that difference, we can truly be the healing of our wounds.
You write a little bit about cultural bodies and
Yeah,
how if we think about like if we have the capacity as maybe trans people do or people who have aged enough to know that disability comes
yeah,
to us if we live long enough,
yeah,
um,
yeah,
that if we have the capacity to understand that physical bodies change, then we can have a way of talking about what happens in cultural bodies as
yes,
they change, either to become more welcoming or more constricting, but ways that we can kind of transform culture around us in a way that is, you know, rooted in ritual or is seeking to be more loving and kind to the community
yeah,
around it.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Do
Yeah, I
you
mean,
think?
when I think about
Yeah, go ahead.
can I just comment on the cultural
Yeah.
body? I mean, the cultural body piece is so interesting to me because I think what we're seeing right now in every institution is an effort to silence bodies of difference, whatever that difference be, whether it be around ability, emotional acuity, or race, or gender, or class. You know, there's this effort to silence bodies, to suppress bodies, and within institutional life, if we're seeing that, we can look into community life or the public square and see something very parallel, something very similar. So I think about racial profiling, for example, that is still happening, and if it's happening in the public square or in community life, where is it also showing up in institutions? And I would say it's mostly showing up in white serving institutions, and so that makes me very nervous for the students that I have who are trans or queer or of color. Certainly, black and brown students face some of the highest scrutiny in white serving institutions, and so this cultural body, this collective body thing, we need to pay careful attention to it because if we are truly one body, however we want to interpret that, we have to be a body composed of difference. Because if we flatten out our differences, as many people are trying to do, we come up with Christofascism, white Christofascism, and that is very scary. And we should all be alarmed by that kind of move. And so, you know, in the book, I try to talk about the celebration of difference, and the proliferation of difference. And you know, when I heard Bishop Megan that you were elected bishop, I thought, here is an example of the proliferation of difference within a white serving institution. And so, how do we build on that momentum? Not to play the card of identity politics, but to actually faithfully celebrate difference, the politics of radical difference, which is very different than diversity. Diversity is just a code word for tolerance. What we're dealing with here is difference within cultural bodies, within the collective body, and when we celebrate difference, I think we do something like bring heaven to earth.
Yeah, I love that image. But you also I think write about struggling with the words to use as we celebrate that diversity. And one of the terms that you use to describe yourself in the book is a conditionally white Latinx person,
Yeah.
right? Will you say a little bit more about what that kind of idea means to you and why you're sorting out kind of the language to you, like in the midst of how we talk about race and our flesh.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I unlike my mother, I am melanin deficient, and I have the melanin deficiency of my white father, my Scottish father. And I think it's important that I name that I have proximity to whiteness because of the color of my skin. My siblings who are darker than I am, don't have the same privileges that I do. Um, and I think that I talk about being conditionally white because I want to talk about race faithfully, that I get treated differently because of power, access, and privilege due to the color of my skin. But I am born of a Mexican woman, and so I need to honor that complexity, and I need to honor my ancestors who struggled through migration and poverty uh, to dream a dream for me, right? And so the wisdom of my ancestors reside in my body, and yet my body moves in the world as a transmasculine person, as a person with skin privilege, with educational privilege. And even though I am, at times working poor and mostly working class, I can still pay my rent because I have a bank account, and even though I'm living a life of a deep hustle, um, I still have this financial privilege to pay my rent and pay my bills, right? And so I think it's important to have a really honest conversation around the social construction of race and how that gets played out in a carceral state, right? In a state that imprisons the imagination and polices the imagination, and fills prisons and other institutions with black and brown people, my siblings, our siblings, and I, I want, I'm all about working with white-bodied folks because I think that that's part of my work to connect the dots for white-bodied folks, but do it in a way where there's an invitation to hold my deeper complexity as a mixed race Latinx. And I think doing that hopefully will shed some light for white bodied folks to kind of move from reading all the books and having talking points to having an embodied awareness about things like racism, and understanding that racism was imported from Europe as white on white violence, and then was it pivoted into being native violence and genocide, and now as we see it as things like anti-black racism and so forth. And so I just think it's important for someone like myself who lives in between so much racially and so forth, uh, just to be honest about what we're facing right now in the church and in the academy and in our common life together.
And my experience is that you're not someone who, at least from what I took from the book, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that you're not someone who's trying to like stack up cups of privilege to decide who has the most and who has the least. My experience is that you describe the places where you felt like you have privilege, but you didn't name the equal or opposite as a thing. But what you do talk about is trauma.
Yeah.
Trauma and violence that people carry and that clings to us and scars us and reshapes us. And so I'm still, I think, processing that, and trying to see like if I've understood what you're up to in the midst of that. But I think one of the things that you named in that really kind of spoke to me, that I'm still pondering, that I wonder if you have thoughts about, is when you were talking about how kind of violence permeates in communities, especially communities of culture. That you're right. Many of us have latched onto violence as a way to leverage power to get our needs met. And I'm wondering if you can just speak a little bit more about how you have noticed that violence becomes a mechanism for people to try to seek power
Yeah.
and privilege.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just give a real live example. My partner and I live in Southeast Nashville, where it is populated by working class, working poor folks of color mostly, and there are a lot of gunshots. And there's so much criticism around people of color shooting guns or being in gangs, but we have to reckon with the fact that systems, so police systems, surveillance systems, um, and we can go back to the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers were trying to help their own communities. They were trying to feed their communities. But what happened is the FBI infiltrated communities like the Black Panther, and other police authorities infiltrated these communities with violence. And so these communities are now using the tools that they were given by these systems, often using them against their own communities. And so when we talk about black on black violence or brown on brown violence, we have to remember that that is a derivative of white on white violence, the very thing that is at the root of racism. And I think we need to have an honest conversation about that, right? How do we eradicate violence? Well, we need to learn how to have healthy relationships with power. And a lot of people don't know how to have healthy relationships with power. As someone who is ordained and does have a PhD, there's a passage in Philippians 2 where it talks about Christ emptying himself. Right, the Greek word for that is kenosis, or this self emptying, and I have to be very wise with the power that I have, because I could harm a lot of people. I could weaponize my intellect against people. And then what will that accomplish? Well, it will create trauma for people and harm. And I think that what we could be doing as people who are leaders, certainly faith leaders, certainly leaders with skin tones like ours, is modeling a healthy relationship to power through things like conversation, right? Having a pedagogy of invitation instead of this pedagogy where it's us against them, or this power over. So much of the world is composed of a power over relationality. And what I try to argue in the book is that when we practice a being in conjunto, or a being together with one another, that's a different kind of power relationship. That's a power with. And so I call myself a reluctant leader. I was trying to become a professor, sit in my office by myself and read my books. And yet I find myself being on a stage with a platform, and I'm like, that is not what I was trying to do. And so what I am now trying to do is have as many public conversations with religious leaders, with community leaders, with politicians, um, rather than perpetuate a platform culture that just feeds into the toxicity of celebrity culture. So, what I'm really trying to model here is how can we be with people, and how can we practice a power with people? It's how I run my classes in graduate school. We are a communal learning cohort. We are learning together. I don't lecture. I ask my students to read and come prepared to discuss, and then I invite my students to talk with me, and that is a different form of power. I hear often from my students that they've never had a class like mine, that professors expect them to expect students to um, listen to a lecture, to passively receive the wisdom of the doctor. And I think if we are actually going to get free from the bullshit, pardon my expression, um, then we have to compost the bullshit and actually lean into each other's stories. And so that's why I share so much about my life on social media. It's why I wrote the book that I did. Very honest, vulnerable, transparent book. Because if we don't lead with transparency and vulnerability, we can't foster a power with model of relationship with power.
Yeah, I have a similar kind of sense of that. Maybe it's because we both have tried to study Taekwondo. I
Yeah.
got my black belt when I was 12. Just one of the many intersections we share, right?
Yeah.
But then I became a pacifist kind of later in life and have
Yeah.
really tried to like study nonviolence and find ways to um, figure out how to dwell in the discomfort or dwell in the agitation long enough that I can figure out what's under the anger or what's under the
Mm.
desire or what's you talk about it's not just the violence but our imagination of violence that
Yeah.
is part of our kind of almost an obsession in our world with the way that kind of media happens, but ways that we sort of retrain our brains and retrain our practices and retrain our bodies to be uncomfortable enough to find out what's next, as
Yeah.
like Thich Nhat Hanh would say, or what's the soul force that we have, as Gandhi would say, that we're going to lead from that soul rather than from the agitation. And I think it's like Job sitting in the hole. Job's had everything taken away, and all even the friends seem to be against him, and he just sits in this mud hole naked because he's even lost his clothes at that point.
Yeah.
And sure, later in the book, he's going to get a bunch of stuff back, but who cares that you got a new family? You still grieve the previous that were
Yeah.
lot, right? So you don't get it all back. You sit there with your scars, and so I just feel like that's kind of been part of my journey to try to be someone who um, seeks ways to change systems that are complicated and in some ways wrong, but to
Yeah.
change them from the inside by being a person who's comfortable sitting in the agitation. And not that I'm right or I have all the answers or that I deserve power that other people don't have. That's not what I'm saying, but that trying to be someone who's in conversation rather than a principle. It's a practice, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
something we have to cultivate and try to be a part of. And
Yeah.
I don't know if that's maybe that's a having neurodiversity thing, and or maybe it's it could be a lot of things, but I
Yeah.
think comes from a desire to encourage embodied resilience in the world is the best
Yeah.
way I can put it, I think.
Yeah. I just finished a book by Thich Nhat Hanh titled "You Are Here," and it was basically about practicing presence. And we don't know how to do that very well with one another. I mean, we hardly know how to be human with one another anymore, much less practicing presence with one another. And I think if we could really cultivate the art of listening to one another and with one another, I think we could practice presence in a different way, and then power would show up very differently from a place of presence.
Well, you write a sentence that really got me, and that's that relationships will save us, but only if they're the right kind of relationships, right? And
Yeah.
so that's the whole rest of the work of our living, I think, is how
Yeah.
can we be people in those kinds of relationships, and how can we foster those kinds of relationships? How can we seek them and attract them? How can we be people who are dwelling in the story
Yeah.
as much as we can?
Yeah. Yeah.
Got
It's why I
any
love
got
Advent
any
so
any
much.
ideas about how people can cultivate those relationships? There's a lot of people aching right now in the midst of
Well,
everything that's hard.
yeah, I mean, I think it's why I love Advent so much is that there's this anticipatory hope. And I wonder if we can practice Advent with one another. Can we anticipate with one another presence? And can we be generous with one another? I feel like Advent is a season of generosity. Um, and then, when in Advent, it's not Christmas, right? Those are two different seasons. And so when we get to Christmas, can we celebrate? Can we live into that generosity with one another um, through a kind of gift giving of our time and of our energy? And then then there comes Epiphany, and can we celebrate the presence? The liturgical calendar. It's so much in my bones. I've never been a big fan of Lent because I feel like I had to grow up with not much, and so I didn't see a reason in giving up stuff. But I do see the discipline in it and the spiritual side of things. but really there's something around Advent that keeps drawing me. And I just wonder if we could learn from the anticipation of Advent. Could we restore ourselves, um, with a kind of humanity that is generous, a generous humanity? And and I don't know, because there are so many people who are aching and hurting, and there's so much grief, and how do we lament all that we've lost over the past 3 years? How do we sit in the many wounds that are yet to be scarred over? And finally, how do we speak from the scars that are not yet present? There's still so much woundedness, and I think, for me, it's relationships all the way down, and yet it's also finding the right kinds of relationships. And so, you know, how do we steward those relationships? I think we first have to know ourselves very well and be grounded in ourselves before we can lean into someone else's story. But with the right kinds of relationships, we can do it.
Well, I want to invite some of the folk. We've had a lot of really generous commenters who are enjoying your conversation and thanking you. And I want to invite some folk. If you have any questions or comments you want to lift up, feel free to do so, and we'll pop them in here if you're watching live. But I was wondering if while we're seeing if folk want to lift up questions, if you would talk a little bit about what becoming is, right? What being a person who is becoming is
Yeah,
in terms of a journey.
it's a well. Let me just say that becoming was popular before Michelle Obama wrote her book on becoming. I mean, it's got a long philosophical history, and becoming has been a part of the philosophical vernacular for a long time. And I was very interested in the philosophy of becoming, as it relates to being. How can we be a being that is becoming? And what I mean by that is, how can we always be changing? How can we always be in process? How can we always practice this relationality with the change that is around us? The world is changing as faster than I can breathe. And so how can we really lean into that change? I think we'll find wisdom in that change. And so becoming is really processes of change. And how do we celebrate that change? The change that is hopefully going to get Judge Jackson to the Supreme Court bench, the change that has celebrated you and consecrated you as bishop, um, the change that has given me credentials to practice being a public theologian. How can we really lean into those processes of change? Um, it's hard work, but it really does take a village and a diversity of tactics. It's not one way or the highway. It is a multiplicity of tactics. And then how do we be honest with those strategies and steward those strategies and be faithful in the small things?
I like that. Um, we do have a question from Hannah. Hannah wants to know, how do we become more embodied?
It's a great question. I write about in the book, when I showed up to my therapist's office in California, I said, I want to have a relationship with my body. And so my therapist and I have been working for 7 years now about how to be embodied. And sometimes it's as simple as just breathing. And so being more embodied is, can we be present with our breath? Can we breathe in curiosity and breathe out distress? And if we can, then we're one step closer to being embodied. And we have to remember that embodiment is not an arrival, it is a process of becoming. And so, can we just lean into the slow processes of change and breathe together? Can we go out on a walk and feel the sun shine on our skin? That is embodiment. Can we move from talking points about racism to an actual embodied awareness? I can never know what it's like to be a Black trans woman, but I can have embodied awareness around the threat that they feel, the threat of violence. And that is the process of becoming, right? Being present with the changes, being present with the somatic wisdom that is available to us.
Poco a poco.
Poco a poco.
Yeah, little by little, just trying.
Yeah.
Is that, I mean, like just stepping into it, even if it means you stepped into it and had to clean your shoes, right? Like
Yeah, and I think
seeking it.
the myth of perfectionism,
Hmm.
we need to let go of perfectionism, because embodiment is not about perfecting the skill. It's
Hmm.
about it's about leaning into the restoring of ourselves.
Hmm. Yeah, breathing in curiosity, breathing out distress, feeling the sunshine, cultivating embodied awareness. Absolutely. Yeah. I wonder if there is a Bible story or anything like that that is speaking to you in these days.
Hmm. That's
And it,
probably,
or I could say sacred story if you want to expand it bigger.
yeah. I mean, I think I'm thinking about the story that sort of always compels me is in Genesis, when the writer of the Hebrew book Genesis said, "And God hovered over the Tehom." That's the Hebrew word there, the Tehom, the place of the deep. And the place of the deep for me is the place where trans bodies emerge. And as a trans masculine person who continues on their journey, I am just trying to dance with the Spirit of God in the place of the Tehom. And I would say that you do that every day, um, with God and with the Holy Spirit. And there's something really magical about that. So they're really beautiful. So I really like that story, and I love the emphasis when in the creation stories that we have, where where the writer says, "And God rested." And we have to remember that rest is political, and we can be very tired right now with all that is going on. I mean, the world is really on fire. I read an article the other day that talks about a new world order, that governments are coming together to create a new world order. That is very scary to me. That is very scary to me. And so I am trying to lean into the practice and the discipline of Sabbath as much as I can. And so Sabbath stories are very helpful for me. Church culture doesn't really foster Sabbath. Priests and pastors um, don't really get a day off and don't really get to rest. They're responding to pastoral care calls, they're responding to crises, they're having to prepare homilies or sermons, and yet I wonder, can we cultivate a culture of rest in our sacred spaces so that we can actually breathe in curiosity? I think without Sabbath, I don't know how we will continue.
Yeah, rest is super important. In part because I think it revives us and helps us have the energy. I'm an introvert. I think you're an introvert. I think it
I'm
said
an
that in
intense introvert. I think I was a Buddhist monk in my past life.
here. I think, and because we have Enneagram fans watching, I think you also said you were 5,
I'm a 5.
if I remember that correctly.
Yeah.
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 There is, I think, a balance that people have of like wanting to feel like they are special and precious and beloved of God and connected to community. And so they want to find this dance between I'm the only me and I am a full community. And I think this might be what Anna might be asking um, in the question, help me not feel like a snowflake. You got
Mm-hmm.
any thoughts about that?
Well, I don't know that I understand the question, so I'm going to take a stab.
Yeah.
I think that question could be interpreted lots of different ways, but every snowflake is it gives a different imprint, right? And and I would say that our embodied awareness can we can each give a different imprint on our community, just like a snowflake. And so I would say, let's be snowflakes. Let's be composed of radical difference, and let's build community from the place of difference, and lean into one another's stories. But I may be misunderstanding the question. I my brain works differently.
Yeah, you took it in a way that answers a question. We don't know if it answers Anna's question, but I think you did
Right.
pretty good. We have because you brought up Genesis, we have a follow up question about that. Do you have thoughts about people who argue that Genesis's creation stories support heterosexuality based on the idea of complementarity?
Well, these kinds of discussions are designed to keep those who are most impacted by power serving systems on the underside.
Yeah.
And if we read, I was a biblical language minor in college, and so I've taken 2 years of Hebrew and 2 years of Greek. And if I remember my Hebrew correctly, I have translated the first 3 chapters of Genesis from Hebrew to English. If I remember my Hebrew correctly, God created Adam, earth creature, and we have read gender into that, and we have read hierarchies into that, and we have created hierarchical systems like complementarianism, which is a separate but equal idea, which is really just replaying segregation, which is fortifying patriarchal systems and undermining anyone who is not a patriarch or a cisgendered man. So I think we have to be careful to note that gender was introduced into hermeneutical interpretations at a time when power was being restructured to create what we now have as empire religion, as Christianity. And so, um, I think that complementarianism is dangerous for anyone who is not a white man, and anyone who is not in power. And the Bible doesn't affirm or deny any kind of sexuality, except it does talk about um, multiple partners. There were men with multiple partners, and then that gets legitimated until certain power structures delegitimize it. So we think about um, kings having many wives, and we see how extramarital relationships, there are conditions for that. We also read about sexual assault in the Bible, where women, as it's counted, don't give consent or aren't able to give consent, right? And so I would say we need to have a hermeneutic of suspicion and retrieval as we retrieve some of these stories, and ask ourselves, how do we be faithful in the small things? What does it mean to read scripture theologically in an effort to establish the reign of God? I'm a liberationist, so I read the Bible as a liberationist.
Yeah, I wonder if it's as simple as just trying to figure out like what the word and means. Like male and female, God created them, or male and female, God created them, right?
Yeah.
It's like what does the word and mean? And
Yeah.
you know, a whole different religion can be created based on different ideas of what the word
Yeah.
and means, or of, or
Yeah.
the, and it becomes a very strange practice. What I have seen in life, and maybe in the life of institutional churches, is that sometimes the process of debating becomes a process of distracting people from their vocation, or distracting
Yeah.
people from their call, right?
Yeah.
Like when people say, if only you'd tell me why these Bible verses mean that God can love you, then we'll love you too. And then you come back and you say, okay, I wrote it all out, or here's the conversation.
Yeah.
And then they'll say, great, here's 13 more Bible verses. And so I think it was Mark Jordan at some point when I was at the Pacific School of Religion said, I've stopped with the debating because I've learned the debating has just been a way to waste my time so God can't use me in the world. And
Yeah.
there was something very liberative of hearing that. Not that we don't need to have those conversations, particularly if it allows us to be in the cultural body of our family, or whatever it is that's going to restore relationships. I'm not saying never be in relationship or never restore those things. Like your whole book, by golly, is about the opposite of that, right? Being a part
Yeah.
of liberation through that. But I also want to give people permission who are just
Yeah.
tired of always having to justify God loving them, even though it's so clear that God, in fact, does love them. That if you think it's just a conversation for the sake of wasting your call, go do what God is up to with you. Because that will be sometimes bigger and better proof than any sort of Bible study debate, or right.
Yeah. And I also don't debate. I ask for people to be curious with me.
Yeah.
If people want to
Yeah.
fight and debate, I
Yeah.
just, I mean, like, I am trained in logic. I'm happy to argue with people, but
Yeah,
I'm
you
not
could talk
going,
about the definition of the word and all day, and probably in
right.
Latin. Yeah.
But I'm unwilling to do that when people's lives are on the line.
Right.
I just
Right.
I just refuse to debate the humanity of people. I mean, on Translate Visibility, I posted on Twitter, can we love ourselves out of our wounds and lean into our divinity? And I would rather focus on that than debating trans people's existence.
Yeah. Well, I know that you are a person of much wisdom, and we could talk all day, and hopefully we can talk again. I can come to your online ways of talking, and you can come to our online ways of talking. I hope
Yeah.
people will learn more and check out the book, Body Becoming. What's a good way for people to connect with you, either on social media or in a way that feels consensual for you?
Yeah, my DMs are open and I do a lot of connecting and also pastoral care in my DMs. Um, that's iRobyn, both on Twitter and Instagram. And both of those places are my public classroom. I just post ideas and thoughts and invite conversation. And so if folks want to be in conversation with me, come on over to iRobyn. It's IROBYN. And I love connecting. I love relationships. And, of course, if you're ever in Nashville, let me know and we'll sit down for a shared meal.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us today. Blessings on all that you are up to. Blessings on your classes and your writing, and blessings on your being in
Thank
ways
you.
that you want to be blessed, but not in ways that you have been prayed for that have wounded you and injured you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
And
I'm
likewise.
so grateful that you're in the world, and particularly that you took time to chat with us.
Oh, yeah, I'm thrilled. Anytime I get a chance to talk with you, Bishop, I'm excited. And hopefully one of these days we can sit down over a shared meal when I'm in the Bay Area.
Yeah. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you want to say as our final thoughts?
I think the only thing I want to let folks know is that when I left the Bay Area and my faculty post in Berkeley after the 2016 election, I launched my academic scholarship as a collaborative project, which is called the Activist Theology Project. And we have launched an app to build community, to help connect the dots, to help build that embodied resilience. And you can find the app at www.atporch.com. That's the Activist Theology Porch. We would love for you to come hang out with us on the porch. We will be adding classes and lives and circles. Right now, there's a bunch of circles that you can join and connect with folks. But we are really hoping to foster greater theological and ethical literacy for those who think about faith and spirituality, and maybe who want to think about these things outside of academia and outside the walls of the church in a brave space. Come to the porch and do that with us. And maybe one day, Bishop, we can do a live at
Yeah.
the porch and um, and see what bubbles up on the porch.
Yeah, I'm excited to have both metaphorical and literal porch encounters where we can
Yes,
hang out and be in the same place at the same time and chatting about things like this. And thank you again for joining us and for all that you're up to.
thank you so much.
Lutherans, yay!
Yes.
Take care, everybody.